3 o'clock, we'll call the meeting of the Human Resources, Finance, and Property Committee to order. First item is Pledge of Allegiance. Please rise. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right. Any public comments? Don't see. I see a lot of Lake Wabaganish people in the background, but they're all county employees. This is part of our discussion earlier. So I don't see anybody here for public comment. Okay, and all members of the committee are present. So we will move on to the approval of the January 24th minutes, which were in the packet. What are your wishes?
Motion to approve, Mr. Chairman.
Supervisor Leahy moves to approve. Supervisor Gibbs second, or Chair Gibbs seconds. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. All right, we will move on to 6A1, approval of claims and question cross. Christie?
At 10:30 today, we had our workday consultant here, and she helped us build the report. So I do not have for today. We are building it, and we'll have that to you at the next Finance Committee meeting. Plus, we are also doing the budget versus actuals. We were working on those as well. So I would request you could postpone it until the next meeting, and we would be able to get those out to you. But we do have them. We are able to run them. They're in a raw data set in the system, and so we can export them out to Excel. But we just want to make sure that they're in a more useful format. But we have our consultant here this week working on reports and really getting to some of those finer points that we haven't been able to get to. So I would ask for you to please allow us to postpone, and we'll be getting those out to you.
We welcome the news and we'll accept the delay with the hopes of having a wonderful presentation, colorful presentation. Is that overpromising? But we'll find out. So. All right, thank you. We'll then move on to claim disallowance. Mary Jo?
Mr. Chairman, I think you'd need a motion to postpone. I'd so move.
Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer to postpone until the next meeting, the February 21st meeting. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. Let me just ask, I know it's listed as the 21st. Is that okay with you because of the election day? Okay.
We'll make it work.
Okay. All right. We will move on to the claims.
Okay, first claim, Tyler Swan. This is an incident that happened back on September 7th of 2022, where the claimant claims that he was riding his motorcycle on Business Highway 51, turning onto the ramp to go north on Business or I-39, and claims that there was a patch of oil on the roadway that the highway department did not clean up. So he had contacted the police and was told that this patch of oil has been reported before, but nothing has been done about it. And we did some investigating on this. There was no prior knowledge from the highway department of ever receiving notice of a patch of oil, and plus no indication as to where the oil came from, even if it was a gathering of oil from the stoplights there, just from the normal daily traffic. And so based on that and the investigation of the county having no prior knowledge in order to act on it, the recommendation from WMIC, our liability insurer, is to disallow the claim because we had no prior knowledge of any issues to take action on it.
Any questions or motions? Again, we had gone through this process last year, and this is part of the,
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion to deny the claim and
Is there a
move to the
second?
full board for its consideration.
is there a second? Second by Supervisor Leahy. Any discussion? Mike, do we need to send this to the full board?
I was just looking at that. I don't believe we do. Mary Jo's shaking her head no. Lance was giving me a strange look, and I had a strange look on my face as well. I think the answer is no.
So do you wish to modify your motion to,
Sure do.
so the motion is to deny the claim? And any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Sandy Pike.
This claim was reported to the county on January 10th of 2023. The incident date that it occurred on was December 16th of 2022. And this is an incident involving an individual who was parked underneath an overpass off of Stewart Avenue and stopped to turn left to get onto the highway going north. And the claimant alleges that a plow from the Marathon County Highway Department was plowing the overpass or the flyover, and snow from either the plow or snow stuck to the side of the overpass fell onto her vehicle as she was underneath it and had broken her windshield. She had turned the claim into her personal auto insurer, and they paid for it, less her deductible, and therefore she's claiming damages for her deductible. The claim was sent into WMIC, our liability insurer, and they conducted the investigation from some facts we gathered from the Highway Department. We gathered the GPS records, and which indicated the rate of speed that the plow operator would have been traveling. It did verify that there was a plow operator in the vicinity at that date and time, and the actual speed was at 20 miles per hour based on the GPS records. And based on that, WMIC determined we have qualified immunity for that because of the unawareness of snow flying over the overpass and consideration of the amount of speed that was being driven at that time. So they recommended to disallow it based on the immunities that are afforded to us.
Any questions? If not, are there any motions? What are your wishes?
Make a motion to follow the recommendation of our insurance and deny the claim.
It's been moved to deny. Is there a second? Second by Supervisor Lemmer. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of denial of the claim will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right, thank you. Next, under 6B, adoption of the West Side Master Plan. So Jamie? Welcome back.
All right, thank you. I'm just going to go to the plan. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm here before you today to talk again about the West Side Master Plan and try to move this plan through the process. We did take it to the Park Commission again this month, as well as the Environmental Resources Committee. The Environmental Resources Committee is one committee that had asked me to come back with some extra information and had also made the recommendation to do the presentation on the West Side Master Plan to the full county board. So we did the full presentation a few weeks ago, or I guess a month ago now. And then I did also go ahead and do what the Environmental Resources Committee had asked of me, which was really to reconnect with a lot of the users of Marathon Park and that area, meaning the Fair Board, the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point at Wausau, Executive Director, as well as some of our users. And so we did that. Dr. Thomas was here when I did the presentation to the county board from the UW Stevens Point at Wausau campus. So she was here in support and also there to answer any questions if we had any for her. She has reiterated that they have been a partner in this from the very beginning, meaning that part of this was driven for the West Side Master Plan because of the residence hall and what to do with that building and their cooperation with the county to try to figure that out. So that was one of the stemming factors for this plan, as well as the last time we updated this area plan was in 2007. And then if you recall, the other driving factor for this plan was the assumption and the direction from the infrastructure committee that the highway department would be moving, and possibly the parks department would be moving off of West and Party Street. And so we needed to look at this area as a full redevelopment. So as I mentioned at the, and also to reconnect with the Fair Board, I did that. I had a meeting with Mr. Keith Langenhahn to talk about, he's the president of the Fair Board. I did have Rick Seefelt also speak at our Park Commission meeting, as well as he's on the ERC committee. He's the Park Commission chair and also on the Fair Board as well. He was able to take this plan to one of their annual meetings that they had and talk through it with more of the Fair Board members, as well as me talking to Keith, and really looking at like where that midway is kind of section to go in the middle. We have from the last time I presented this to county board, it was just a green space. We did put that road and that sidewalk in there. There is a description of this area of how it would be built at the time that if it were to be moved to this area to be built up to hold the large equipment that's put on it, to allow for drainage. And then the roadways, so a lot of it would be in consideration as we actually design. So as I mentioned at the county board, this is the concept plan. This is the county board's vision of what this park and this area could potentially be. It is not by any means a plan that's set in stone that we have to build it this way. It's a changing document. As I mentioned at the Environmental Resources Committee, we already know that at this very moment, there is no spot that the highway is planning to go. So they may leave, they may not. We did this plan in assumption that they would leave, but if they didn't, that would change this plan. We do know that the cold storage building will come down, so there's a potential that some of this could be shifted to that lot. This whole plan contains items that are contingent upon other items. However, this is the vision, long-term vision for the park. There are things we can do in the immediate future, moving forward in the next 5 to 10 years, and that would be something like the Eastgate Hall and doing some renovations to Eastgate Hall, as that's a revenue facility for us. It's some minor things that have to be done in that building to bring it up to be more efficient and to be more desirable for rentals. We do have to look at our splash pad. It's reached its end of life, so whether we want to take that out altogether or whether we want to rebuild it in a different location, we'll have to look at that as well. As well as the junction. The junction has also been one of those items that's been on my list since I started 5 years ago to say, what are we going to do with this building? It's supposed to be an enterprise fund. It is not. It has a lot of opportunity to be different. So we need to look at that opportunity, whether it's a brand new building or not, or just a renovated building, is something we'll have to look into further. So as we remember, this is a concept plan we're looking at as we, if this is approved by the county board and by you today to go to the county board. We would then sit down as the park commission and prioritize these projects and really determine what are the ones that we can move forward with. They would go through the CIP process, they go through the planning process. We would need engineers involved and stuff like that. So we would prioritize those projects. The other big item within this plan, whether this plan is approved or not, that we as a department in the county have to address is our ice arena and the aged facility and the amount of work that ice arena needs to keep operating, and how many people it affects within this community if it is not open. So it is part of the plan. It can be shifted. Right now it's showing where the highway goes. There's possibly other options, but either way, that facility does need to be evaluated. So we had asked at the county board member if there was any comments or questions of the West Side Master Plan to have them sent to myself or Chair Longenhan from the ERC committee at that time. And the comments I did get a comment from Supervisor Ritter just about if we, as we design this, to keep the horses in mind and how close they are to the midway. We do hear that even today with the lights. Supervisor Zhang had some comments about Eastgate Hall. That's a heavily used facility by the Hmong American Center, and there, he mentioned some acoustic amplification items that need to be done, maybe a kitchen. So more of the, hey, this is what you need to do to renovate this. And then Supervisor Lemmer did reach out with some questions about return on investment and management of the junction, and if there was any sponsorship interest. And those are items that, as I mentioned to Supervisor Lemmer, we would look at as we look at each individual piece and begin to plan that before we would get the okay or the request to move forward. We would definitely look at the return on investment, the uses of it, if we do have that sponsorship dollars, how it's going to get funded and stuff like that. So those are things that we looked at. That's all the comments and questions that I received from the county board. So from the presentation that you saw as a full county board, there have been no changes to this plan other than some clarifying items. We also do know that number 38 on the plan, which in our another plan I have, that's actually grayed out because that's a property that the county currently does not own. So really we can't go ahead and plan something for something we don't own, but that's the long-term vision. That is also currently being looked at by the city of Wausau for a public works facility, so that the owner may or may not sell, that he has not decided whether he's going to sell to the city or to the county or to anybody. So that item would be a really long-term facility if it doesn't get developed by the city or stay under the current private ownership. So nothing on that area is contingent or affects the rest of the plan. This plan shows the 2 areas of pickleball courts. We would not have 2 areas for pickleball courts. We would put pickleball courts in 1 area. It's just the other option. So it's a little confusing on this plan. But that area, number 38, would not be in our scope of our plan at the moment. So with that, I'm not going to go through the whole presentation again. I think you've seen it a couple of times, but I'd answer any questions that you might have and ask that you approve this and send it on to the county board for approval. The ERC did recommend approval to you onto the county board, as well as the park commission did as well.
Jimmy, I just have a clarification.
Mr. Chairman,
Do we?
go ahead.
Do we own, I thought we owned part of that property at West and 10th Yield.
The West and 10th, I do not believe we do. The old Ironworks building,
No, we don't own the Ironworks parcel, we own the cold storage parcel.
which
Cool.
is
Next to it.
third.
Cold storage.
All right. Was that Supervisor Zhang?
I guess that.
Yes, that's me. I just want to start off by saying a big thank you to Jamie for responding back to me so quickly as well too. But I do want to make a clarification and correcting Director Polly as well too. It's not the Hmong American Center that uses that facility; it's the Hmong American community that uses it. We actually don't use it at the Hmong American Center. So just want to clarify that off.
Thank you.
Chair Gibbs.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Jamie, the one question it does relate to the Ironworks building in the city of Wausau potentially use it. Does that limit our flexibility? Obviously it's going to limit our some flexibility, but because if we are not able to locate another location for the highway department. The highway department may need some additional space because some of those buildings are undersized for the size trucks that we have. So the question becomes, if the highway department stays there and we end up utilizing some of that facility or some of that ground space that the cold storage sits on for expansion in the highway department, wouldn't the cold storage building and area there be of advantage to potentially look at moving the ice arena if we have to move that ice arena, or when we move them, when we address the shortcomings of the ice arena?
Yes, yes. Currently, beside the only areas that we have, we've done quite a bit of research on other properties that either the school district owns or the county or the city would own for the ice arena. And right now, our really only options would be somewhere along West Street. So whether it's the area that the county already owns or potentially that ironwork site would be ideal. If those are utilized for highway or other operations, and we had the opportunity for the ironwork site, that would be great. It would definitely be advantageous. If it is developed into the public works site, then we would be looking for other property, most likely to relocate that ice arena to, which could, at this point, we don't have any that we wouldn't have to purchase. So yes, that would affect that.
And I do understand it does it there's so many things that are contingent on other things in this plan, and I'm not opposed to moving the plan forward. I just think that we need to actually think through what kind of challenges that creates for the flexibility that we need if the ironworks is moved into the city's public works, and because I know that there's been discussions on that front. But how that impacts the overall park operations and the overall facilities that we have at the park.
I had a conversation with the mayor in preparation for today on that issue, and she indicated that it was a capital improvement and street maintenance committee, which is very interested in that property, but it hasn't been before the entire council. So we've got a committee, not the council. But she also expressed an interest and willingness to sit down about a potential joint facility, which we've had discussions in the past. So that may be something that, aside from the master plan, we might want to follow up with. Both of us, both the county and the city have hired Variantos, and there may be some opportunities there going forward. Supervisor Hart.
Okay.
Have something else? Thank you, Mr. Chair. One of the things that I had mentioned last time was parking, and I know that Chair Langahan had also mentioned that too, and when that presentation went before his committee. And I support the plan. I know it includes talking with the university about, coming up with solutions. I would just ask that the Parks Department, in talking about that solution, keeps strong consideration for the neighborhood by the university. Mostly, as we said before, if you start charging students, they will find free parking one way or another. And I go back to when I transferred out of the MC to UW Eau Claire, the parking on the streets surrounding that university for like 4, 5, maybe 6 blocks out were just packed. And we have considerably less students here, but this is now completely a commuter college with Marathon Hall going down. So I want to mitigate future calls from constituents in that neighborhood, which I represent, and then my counter on the city council for future constituents to call us and complain that there's parking backed up all the way. I just want to make sure that we have strong consideration when we talk about that in the future. So if that's one more comment that can be added for future discussions. Otherwise, I think this is a great plan. Thanks for working on it.
Thank you.
Other comments? Understanding that the plan doesn't obligate us to any timelines, and there are independent discussions relative to the highway garage relocation that may impact the timing of some of the things. We don't own any property or have a design yet. So it is a concept plan that will need to be broken down and brought back through the KIP process and capital improvement process going forward. Any other questions? Any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would move that we adopt the plan and send it to the full board for consideration.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously.
All right, thank you very much.
All right. All right, next is review and acceptance of the Marathon County Equitable Sharing Agreement in certification.
I think that's me. We have, we received an email that this is a federal grant that the sheriff's got, receive. We had an email that we need to have an acceptance, but we don't know what that format looks like, so we are asking you just to table this until we have further information. But there would be some action possibly this month yet.
So is there a motion to postpone until the February 21st meeting? Moved by Supervisor Leahy. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Marshall. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of postponing it until the February 21st meeting will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries. All right, resolution for use of environmental impact funds to fund repair and replacement of aerators at the Big O Plain. Who's taking the lead? You're taking the lead.
For moral support.
Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kirsty Heidenreich, and I am the County Conservationist for Marathon County. You know Jamie, our Parks and Forestry Director, and we just wanted to talk with you very briefly about the Big O Plain aerator system and our request to use the environmental impact funds to fund a repair and replacement of the aerator system that currently exists on the Big O Plain Reservoir. So we did talk with the Environmental Resources Committee last week, and they did unanimously recommend for us to go before HR Finance and deemed it appropriate to use these funds. And we just wanted to give you a very brief background on the Big O Plain watershed in case you were not familiar with it. So this large watershed takes up a good portion of western Marathon County. You'll see on the map the area highlighted in green is where the watershed is. All the land in that area drains directly into the Big O Plain Reservoir. And the Big O Plain Reservoir is a 7,000 acre reservoir. So all the land in that area represents truly the most extensive agricultural area in Marathon County. 77% of that land in that green area pictured is in agricultural use, and the dominant form of agriculture is the dairy industry. So this watershed does produce challenges because it has very fine textured soils, meaning it can move very easily with water. It's easily transported. And then there's also a lovely extensive man-made drainage system built in. And that's what happens when a tiling is done on fields. Whatever is going onto the field during a rain event or a melting event, it goes down into the tile, into the ditches, and then that is often traveled to our local streams and rivers as well. well. So that hydrology is very flashy, meaning that in a rain event, we see several feet of water in our streams and rivers than we would on a normal non-rain event day, just because so much water moves quickly through the tile systems in the fields. It is estimated that there's 165,000 pounds of phosphorus entering the Big O Plain each year. So, I'm saying that amount so that you know that this reservoir, it is phosphorus impaired. The state of Wisconsin has deemed it so, and it is impaired because it cannot sustain that amount of phosphorus and still support life in the reservoir without help. Every pound of phosphorus can produce up to 500 pounds of algae, and that algae is what robs the water of oxygen. So just from a historical perspective, we can estimate that about 50% of that watershed used to be wetlands. So that just goes to show how much, we have kind of manipulated the natural environment that's supposed to be existing there and helping the area to not become so prone to floods. So it really is a special place. This is a gem in our county. There are about $2 million of economic activity that comes from people recreating on the Big O Plain. I have not been out there myself recently, but I have heard from coworkers that there is just hundreds and hundreds of people out on the ice there right now fishing nonstop. We got to hear at the ERC a presentation talking about all of the beautiful fishery that occurs out there. We learned from our DNR colleagues that were here that this reservoir does actually have the largest northern pike in the state of Wisconsin. So a very, very special fishery. And there are 250 shoreline landowners that live along the reservoir. We do know that they are not the primary users of the reservoir. There's people traveling from all over to use it. Although in a recent survey done a few years ago by UW-Stevens Point, it showed that just about 100 of those landowners are spending about $225,000 a year recreating on that reservoir. So again, a huge economic impact as well. And then, we can't forget that it is home to our most heavily used county park as well. So it's so popular because not only is it a beautiful area, but there's camping, biking, horseback riding, disc golf, and it does bring in almost $200,000 of revenue a year. So in case you're curious what the aerator system looks like out at the Big O Plain, although the aerator system was installed in the 1980s, the equipment was bought used at that time. So we don't even know for sure, but it is believed that the equipment is from the 1960s. So it is very old equipment that is in need of repair. And there has been some of that done over time. In your packet, you did get a little bit of a timeline of the history with the aerators, and you can see all the improvements that have been done over the years as well. And with that, I think if I can just take a 30-second timeout, I wanted to invite one of our partners to come up. Do you agree, Jamie? Do you think? Okay, that sounds good. Okay, Jamie is going to switch with one of my colleagues from WVIC, and I'll let Ben introduce himself. Do you want to introduce yourself? Sure. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Ben Niffenegger, Vice President of Environmental Affairs with Wisconsin Valley Improvement Company.
Yeah, so we're just showing the committee pictures of, not only what the aerators look like, where they're located, but then how they're functioning out on the reservoir itself. So this is kind of a nice bird's eye view of where it is on the reservoir. And do you want to explain how it provides oxygen to the Big O Plain, Ben?
Sure. So there's 14 lines that leave the aeration house that are function with 2 blower motors and then blowers that actually provide oxygen out into the 14 lines. Each of those lines has 2 holes in it. And the way the oxygen works is not like a fish tank where the bubbles actually provide the oxygen. The goal of the bubbles is to really open up the ice to create these holes that you see. And then really it's the wave and wind action that comes in that actually circulates the oxygen from the air down into the reservoir. And so it helps create kind of a limited refuge. As the season goes on, the longer the aerators run, these holes that you see will kind of fuse together and open up larger amounts of water. So when fully functional, you can get anywhere from 40 to 60 acres of open water, which is how it's designed. And it's certainly the largest aeration system, if not one of the largest in the state.
Exactly. Yeah, and 60 acres out of a 7,000 acre reservoir. So that is a very limited refuge for the fish. And we're keeping our presentation very short today, but what we really wanted to focus the presentation on today is about how this is a true partnership to keep the aerators going. And we wanted to tell the story of how much every player in the partnership is a very important piece of the puzzle. And so I'll let Ben talk about WVIC and the in-kind and literal contributions as well.
Sure. So WVIC has been a partner in this project really since the 1980s. We have pretty good data going back to about 2000. And so just from 2000 to this point, we've spent over $100,000 on electrical costs. And so I tried to break it down to kind of more recent time, more recent operations. The last 10 years or so, we're looking at over $165,000 conservatively for staff time, hours, and wages for everyone that's involved. Typically 3 to 4 different employees for WVIC, and then you'll learn more about our partnership with the DNR and some of that involvement. But that includes everything from multiple times a week visits out there, especially in recent years with the continual oil leaking and just the overall poor condition of the system, having to go and fill up oil literally every other day. So both hours and time for monitoring, and then we also do extensive water quality monitoring out there all winter long, starting right around early January through ice out. And that's where we're going every river mile from the dam, 18 river miles up, drilling a hole in the ice and actually measuring the oxygen. And then we create kind of a graphical representation to provide all of the partners, Marathon County, DNR, the Lake Group, to have a feel for where the oxygen levels are so we know when we need to turn the aeration system on. And so that's a critical component, along with just having a great historical data set, which has been used by UW-Stevens Point and researchers throughout the area over the decades to kind of get a feel for really the issues we have out there with our nutrient loading and phosphorus and oxygen depletion. The rest of the costs here are pretty straightforward. Electricity, the water quality laboratory tests, those are all real actual costs, as well as just some of the various mechanical and electrical fixes and updates that have been needed over the last decade. So it's just important to think this is only 10 years. You can basically double this number for the last 20 years for ongoing maintenance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's probably safe to say that the Big O Plain is probably one of the most studied and researched reservoirs and watersheds in Wisconsin. And without the data that WVIC is physically collecting and then also paying for, we wouldn't be able to continue a lot of that studying without it. And then Wisconsin DNR, I'm hoping that we have time for a few questions and answers when this is done, and some of our other colleagues can introduce themselves, because we do have Alan Lucas here from the DNR as well, who I'm sure would be happy to talk with you. But similar to WVIC, the DNR has very substantial annual costs as well. And so they estimate that they're contributing about 340 hours of staff time a year on, this is not just dealing with the reservoir in itself, but it is dealing with the aerators. So, almost $20,000 a year in staff costs, and then supply cost of $3,200. It was hard for us to monetize the cost of plowing and access for getting to the aerator shack, but the other day when we were talking about it, it's kind of like getting to a place in the Alaska wilderness. I don't even know how to describe the type of heavy-duty equipment that they have to use, but it is extremely hard to access it, and they have to have the DNR staff that work at the Mead Wildlife Refuge bring some of their biggest equipment just to plow a pathway to get to the aerators. And so the cost of all that mileage and travel and staff time just to even have access for anyone to get to this is huge in itself. And then in addition to routine annual costs, we certainly want to bring your attention to a very substantial project that the DNR is working on to try to gain permanent access to where the aerators exist. So they are trying to work with a neighbor to get an easement established to get to the shack. But if they do that, they're going to look at a cost of about $60,000 to secure that access. If they are not able to get an easement, they are prepared and have a plan in place to fund almost a $200,000 project to make that permanently accessible. So between just WVIC and DNR's costs alone, we're looking at between $50,000 to $60,000 in annual costs. And we are asking to receive an amount from the EIF funds of $175,000. But even in these matches from our partners, we're looking at recouping those costs over just a couple of years, because that's how much funds that they are distributing and committed to every single year. And then BEPCO as well, the Big O Plains Citizens Organization. We also have a representative from BEPCO with us here, John Kennedy, Vice President, who I'm also hoping can join us in the question and answer session. And BEPCO has been instrumental to keeping the aerators at work. So when we needed to revamp and fix some important components of the aerators in 2010, BEPCO really worked hard to fundraise, and they contributed almost $25,000 to that revamp. And they also secured a DNR Lake Management grant of $25,000 to help put together a very important plan that we still use today on strategies for reducing fish kills in the Big O Plain. They contribute many man hours. They contribute to support. They are the carriers of our message to the shoreline landowners and the recreationists in the Big O Plain. And they're also an instrumental part of one of our biggest producer-led groups in Wisconsin, the O Plain Partnership for Integrated Conservation, EPIC. So that's an important group that we have trying to be boots on the ground conservation work in Western Marathon County. Do you have anything to add to BEPCO? Okay, great. And then Marathon County, of course, is also in the partnership, and we do contribute via staff time, just to partnership meetings, to staying in communication with our partners. And so Jamie Polly represents the Park Recreation and Forestry Department, and then we also have Conservation Planning and Zoning involved as well. And so Marathon County has historically contributed to the aerators. In 1980, we contributed over $8,000. And then Marathon County did own them from 1980 until 2008. And then in 2010, we contributed almost $30,000 in upgrades, again, using the environmental impact funds for those. But annually, we don't contribute much more than a $500 annual contribution towards the electric costs of the aerators.
Just for perspective, the $500 is about 3 days of operation. It's typically $150 a day for electrical costs. At least that's what it was a couple years ago. I'd have to check our current electric rates, which I'm sure are up a bit now. Sure. So I think we had mentioned the mechanical components from originally from 1980. They were not new in 1980. The blowers and motors were refurbished, and so the tags that we found on the equipment is and the actual owner's guide is 1960s. So this stuff is quite old. Even in 2010, when Marathon County last used some environmental funds, that funding went to the piping and that goes out into the reservoir. Nothing was really done inside the actual building itself. Maybe some minor electrical upgrades, but you have very old equipment there. And so we did go out and get a couple of estimates for upgraded or new motors and blowers, as well as the electrical configurations, and that's where we have the range of $125,000 to $150,000. We had talked as a group about the importance of, at least contracting out with an engineer to review the general scope. The whole system was engineered actually by the Army Corps of Engineers in cooperation with the DNR and WVIC. So the engineering is pretty sound, but in terms of upgrading to new equipment, having some outside eyes that are actually experts in this field, which none of us in this working group are, was important. And so that's why we have another $25,000 for contingency/engineering costs to see if we're missing anything. And then we'll just note, in terms of timeline, even if we were to be able to acquire funds, come together and purchase these, we're looking at about a year lead time for new motors or new blowers. And so we'll kind of limp through this season. We had staff out there today, actually, and thankfully the oxygen levels are looking good as of today, but we know every winter it's a slow decline, and conditions could change within a week or two. So we'll be thinking about getting the aeration system kind of up and running right now, just as a precautionary measure should conditions worsen, and we're hoping that things will work. So we may have to limp through this year and next winter with hopefully having these fully operational going into the following winter. So I think I jumped ahead a little bit in terms of the timeline, but this is where our next step really is having an engineer evaluate everything. And then we already have a draft MOA between the DNR, Marathon County, BEPCO, and WVIC. That was mimicked off previous MOAs that were used. And so that's basically ready to go once we can finalize the details. And then also, you want to
I
touch
can
on
touch
that?
on that, sure. We want to do whatever we can to be proactive in securing funding because we do know that we need a substantial amount of funds to repair and replace these components, and they are truly on their last leg. So my department frequently does apply for DNR lake grants, a lot of times specifically for staff time to help us, especially in our eastern lakes part of the county. But we did connect with the DNR lake grant team to discuss if it would be viable to apply for a lake grant specifically for some extra funds for the aerators should we not receive these funds. They did welcome us to apply and said it would be a viable project. However, the cap on those grants is not enough to fund what we need to do. That being said, we do plan on applying that for, again, this fall because we are a little bit nervous with only a $25,000 contingency that certainly there could be something that comes up that would go above and beyond that contingency, let alone, we do need, of course we would need more maintenance funds in the future. So that is something we are additionally doing to try to be proactive, although we know that acceptance is not guaranteed, even if we do apply for one of these grants. So that would be this fall. Those grants are due in November, and then winter 23 through 24 is when we would continue with the hopes that we would be able to get all the components we need to have everything running in 2024.
What is the cap for those DNR grants that you mentioned? There's a cap. How much is that?
Yeah, typically $150,000, and it depends on the scope of the project. Typically, our department does not apply for more than $100,000 because the success tends to lessen once you ask for above it. We've learned by example because we've applied for those for many years now. So, and then the very last part of our presentation, just wanted to again tie this all back to the strategic plan. I know it's always important to do that, when we have these important asks to our committees. And so this really is something that is fulfilling our objective of protecting, enhancing the quantity and quality of groundwater and surface water supplies. We're getting there through these three strategies listed on the screen. We're working hard to not only create new partnerships, but to really work even more so within the existing partnerships that we have and make them stronger, more efficient, and try to think of out-of-the-box solutions to get to what we need to have done. And so with that, I think that's the end of our presentation.
So I forwarded to you, Christy had sent me the draft MOA, and I forwarded that to all the members during the meeting, so we have that. Do you have any questions? Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question as to, I know you've went through who contributes what. Are any of the other partner agencies willing to contribute toward the purchase or the engineering toward these aerators?
I didn't catch the last part. Did you say cover the engineering or the purchase or both?
Both. So I have the BEPCO, the WVIC, the DNR, and Marathon County are all in partnership, right? So are any of the other agencies, I know you addressed the DNR, but are the other two willing to contribute toward the purchase and engineering costs?
So obviously I can only speak for WVIC, and I'll let the others comment. I think given the historic track record and the amount of dollars that the company has put into a system that we don't own or utilize or need, really out of a partnership, over $500,000 in the last 20 years, feel like we're committed to continuing to do that. And so that's where we weren't interested in a capital purchase investment in the actual equipment. We're willing to commit to the continued operation as we have been. And I'll go back to what Kirsty had said. Within 3 years of our operational costs, that would be the equivalent of Marathon County's contribution. So
I have some questions relative to the MOA. So the county buys it, but the DNR owns it. Tell me how that works.
So that is how it is currently set up. So Marathon County owned it until 2008, in which we gifted it to the DNR at that point due to budget cuts in the Parks Department. So that's the exact same setup that happened in the past.
So are we, let me rephrase the question. Are we buying the aerator or are we contributing to the purchase of the aerator?
I'm not sure if I see the difference.
The difference is ownership in long-term liability and obligations. So are we buying the aerator or are we contributing to the purchase of the aerator?
If it's okay with you, I would like to invite my DNR colleagues to help answer this question because they have also talked with their DNR council on how
Well,
this.
this is a question directed to you as the county. I need to know from your department's perspective, no offense, Hal, what is our role on this? Because I think it's material to our discussion.
Sure.
So what is your perception? Are we owning or are we making a contribution?
So this is how we are envisioning it, although of course we are open to guidance from anyone at the county if you would envision this differently. So we are envisioning using the EIF funds to purchase the various components. We know that due to the estimates we've already gotten from various contractors, you cannot hire a person to fix and replace these aerators. They're separate electrical people, they're separate HVAC people, they're separate motor people, which is again why we need an engineer to help us make sure, okay, the complete package is good. Okay, so Marathon County would help facilitate those purchases and then engineering to happen. When the system is upgraded, it would be gifted to the DNR because Marathon County does not want to own them. So we would simply facilitate the use of the EIF funds. If we do have components that need to be put out in an RFP, we would facilitate that. And then when those funds are used and done, then it would be gifted to the DNR, and Al is prepared to make comments on how that transaction could potentially happen.
But again, I'm looking at it from a process perspective. So this is a capital expenditure or capital KIP project, is it? Not in that context, and I'm looking to attorney, then we are then transferring ownership of a county asset. These need to be, I think these need to be flushed out. So if we are using county resources, although it's the environmental impact fee, are we not conducting a capital project that would be subject, because it's over the threshold, a capital go through the KIP process? The long-term disposition of the property is another issue, and then we would have to look at our county ordinances as how they apply. But this is a significant investment. Christie?
I believe the last time we used the, whatever the ATC funds they're now called, was a purchase. We did not purchase. We provided a contribution to the Big O Plain town of Bergen, and then Bergen then worked with Bebco to maintain or purchase aerator supplies the last time that we did that. So it was not, we contributed funding, and it was from the same funding source to town of Bergen, and they were the host community for the aerators last time.
Al, if you want to come up and address it, but I think I'm looking at the internal mechanisms of how we make this work.
Yeah, I believe that's correct. I believe the township was the host, and then that was, it's somewhat unclear how that transferred to the department as far as ownership. But I did talk with our internal I guess, finance people about this process. And I think under the guise of the MOA and then also with our gift process, that's something that we could accept then. If, say, this equipment was purchased, and depending on which entity purchased it, and then it came to the department, we could take ownership of it. So, we'd have to work through some of the, there's probably some hoops and things we got to kind of figure out, but I think it's possible. They had given me some examples of other, I guess, entities that we worked with in other parts of the state where we've taken ownership of some pretty large capital type expenditures, and it wasn't a problem. So.
I'm looking to Michael, who's got his hand on his mic.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question, and maybe Christy has the answer, maybe she doesn't. If the town is the host community, does the town need to be involved in this from an action by their board?
At the time, this was still the ATC fund, which had different parameters on it, and we used it specifically for environmental issues. And we also had a different ranking system for it, which I think then now we've had clarification it could be used for any items. And that's why the host was another municipality. So at the amount of $31,153. But they then dealt with BEPCO, and that's how we had done it in the past, although some of those criteria have been lifted on the funding source.
So, Mr. Chair, it seems to me that utilizing the town as a host community isn't necessarily required in this instance, but I think your question still stands as to, is the county the initial purchaser and then is there a transfer, or is the county a contributor and someone else is making the purchase?
And I think that was the intention originally too, because it was.
Christy, if you could speak into the microphone, please.
I think Mike's point is the same. The way that we did it last time is we were a contributor. We had to run it through the village due to the constraints on the funding at that time. And the final person or group that had that was BEPCO at the time. So we were just a contributor, but we used that mechanism to get the funding to them.
And I was,
Supervisor Marshall.
Is BEPCO a lake association that has property tax assessment? I know that up north, when you have a aerator, it's usually supported by the people largely who are property owners in that area. And so aerators up north are typically supported by landowners through that property tax assessment.
Through the creation of a lake association.
yeah, John Kennedy from BEPCO did come today prepared to answer that question because we thought that you guys would ask that if he's allowed to grab a mic. Yeah.
BEPCO is a 501c3 organization, and we are not a lake association. We are just a citizens group, so we have no taxation authority.
So there is not a true lake association on the Big Old Plain Reservoir. And even for citizens that do join BEPCO, a family membership for a year is $25. So, a lot of times when we're talking about contributions for funding, we'll hear in meetings from John, okay, BEPCO has, $6,000 right now. So it is a different setup than what we often do see in northern Wisconsin, where there's those pot of funds put aside by the lake associations to help fund capital projects. Yes, of course.
I just wanted to add a clarifying statement. The term we're looking for would be lake districts have taxing authority. Lake associations, similar to John's, are also a 501c3. So whether it's a lake association or a group, it still has the same. It still doesn't have the same authority as a lake district with taxing authority. They're similar to sanitary districts, and a number of WVIC reservoirs in northern Wisconsin are lake districts for that purpose, to be able to raise funds internally.
Thank you for that clarification. I know I pay with my place on Little St. Germain every year into that. other questions? Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I just wanted to keep tabs on the EIF balance because prior to approving the groundwater plan, we had about $550,000, and then we contributed to the groundwater plan. And then with that, that would leave about $100,000 in the fund, but we are still getting about $60,000 roughly contributed annually, which will wean out eventually, but that's kind of currently where we stand. I just want to make sure that's still correct.
That is correct,
Okay.
100%.
Thanks.
John, if I might.
Go ahead, Chair Gibbs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Well, my question, I guess, relates similar to what, and I apologize, but I got bumped off because I still haven't got internet worth a speed worth a darn. But so I've called back in on my phone. The question I have, so I lost part of the conversation, was relating to ownership and whether or not we're purchasing the equipment and ultimately transferring ownership. If we are, if that's fine, I guess I would lean towards Corp Counsel to ensure that we can do that legally. Second becomes insurance if we have where the insurance on the equipment is for the future. I mean, we're talking between $125,000 and $150,000 worth of cost of equipment, but who is providing insurance if the county's transferring it? Is the MOU address or MOA address who's going to carry the insurance on the property if lightning were to strike the motors and blow them up or whatever? So that's where my question lied on.
Yeah, and I believe the department would be responsible for the insurance aspect of the equipment then, like it is right now for the existing equipment.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
I hate to do this, but these are material discussions, and Mike, as it relates to if we run this through a county purchase, and it's over the $30,000 threshold, it would need to go through the KIP process, would it not?
Well, I believe it would. We're kind of in the state of what is the KIP process.
But it would need to somehow be amended
Yes.
to the 2023 KIP for the expenditure of funds, or not?
If it's our,
Well, if we're
Yes,
paying for the system and then we're gifting it, the second, I've got a follow-up question. In that, can we, do our surplus property ordinances allow us to gift this to them?
yes.
So, okay. And I apologize, but we just got the MOA and haven't had a chance to really delve into it. Supervisor Hart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Is there a necessary timeline on getting this off the ground? I'm just looking at is there anything any of these associations are looking at to get this purchase sooner rather than later? Are we on any time constraints? Thank you.
I think the time constraints are just the unknown that we know we have a failing system, but nothing that's leaking oil and needs to have a quart of oil put in it every other day is sustainable. And so it has limped along for, since 1960s when they were built. And so it's just, mainly I think the group got together because we wanted to raise awareness for people that if conditions are dire, whether that's this year or next year, and there is a fish kill, there is a potential that the aeration system may not work. And there's going to be a lot of fingers pointed at that time. And those fingers will be pointed at WVIC, Wisconsin DNR, Marathon County, and BEPCO. So it kind of started as an awareness campaign, and then looking at where can we collectively acquire funds and then continue to maintain in the future.
I think one of my concerns relative to this agreement is that So now we're looking at $175,000 out of the county, and we've got environmental impact fund dollars available. What about next time? And at what time do we clarify the role? And while the MOA is for a 5-year period, I think we need some certainty into what the roles and responsibilities of the parties are going forward. And I think that would be time to have that meaningful discussion would be now, to clarify what the roles and the expectations are. And I'll just liken this to the aquatic therapy pool. When they came through for a request, there was an expectation that they generate half the cost. And is there a need for a lake district? And I understand full well that the problem with the Big O Plain is due to, I will say, in many cases, poor agricultural practices and environmental stewardship practices upstream that result in the loading of the phosphates and the nitrates in the Big O Plain. The county has a very clear role because of our presence there as a park and recreation facility, so we belong at the table. The question is what's our role relative to some of the other contributors there? And I think that we would benefit from a better clarification of the roles going forward. And I think this agreement or MOA should get into the expectations. If it's going through the KIP process and we're the owner until the transfer, then we have to follow our processes, and then we have to, I think, spell out if it is a gift at that time, that's a gift at that time. But I don't see that addressed in this agreement. So I think there's probably some work that needs to be done on clarifying those roles and responsibilities. But
I can comment on that if you would like. Yeah, just to briefly comment on that, this MOA, the draft was finalized in December of 2022, and we did meet over a half-a-year period of time to update that MOA that was last updated in 2017. And so we felt like we were able to take it as far as we could without knowing if we were going to be able to receive funds from Marathon County, what those funds would look like, and then how everything would play out. Obviously we can't write that into an MOA until we have some of those answers. And so it is currently left unsigned because we are totally open for suggestions on how that should be framed, but all of the partners are ready to reframe that in an appropriate way in which everyone feels comfortable with.
so any other questions? Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Not a question, but I think that considering that the committee members don't have the MOA to look at it, I really don't think the issue needs to be tabled until we can answer some of the questions you've brought up, as well as review the MOA.
The MO was sent out earlier, but again, you'd not had a chance to look at it. And, any other questions?
Maybe not a question, Mr. Chairman, but a comment.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think because, and this is probably, I would have to have a discussion if we were to table it to a future meeting. I would have to discuss with the chairman of the ERC committee if he wished it to move it to the full board, because one committee cannot stop action of another committee. So ERC has approved it and moved it to the full board for its consideration. And so I just, and I'm not saying that he wouldn't, I just wanted to let everybody know that if they chose not to delay it, it still would go to the full board.
And we have a meeting again on the 21st. Mike?
Just a piece of clarification. If the intent would be to bring this up at like the next meeting, tabling would kill this until the next county board is seated, so the correct motion would be to postpone. Just.
Okay. Any discussion? Cody?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's more of a point of direction. I just want to, with considering that we have a very old machine that we really want to get running smoothly, or replace everything. I think we should move this along sooner rather than later. That doesn't mean we have to take action today, but I guess it's kind of a direction for the chairs, and just making sure that we get this on the agenda for the next meeting and get this kind of expedited, so we can talk through this and approve it or not, but provide direction. I understand having a old machine. I have a really bad car and I really need to get it replaced. So when you kind of talked about like needing to put oil in, I get it. So I appreciate that point. And I wanted to make sure that we move forward expeditiously. Thank you.
Could I make one quick comment?
One other question I had, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
And maybe this question is to Christy. I don't know, because I think if I remember hearing at least at one of the discussions was the delay or the lag time in actually getting the equipment from what you were mentioning at ERC. That could be as long as 9 to 12 months to delay getting, even if we ordered it today, getting that equipment. So is that something that is a significant consideration that needs to be taken into, at least at this time, and then the MOA could be further refined at the direction?
Mm-hmm. Yes, Ben did discuss that perhaps when you were off the call, but the blowers itself, even if we ordered them today, when we got an estimate from a contractor, they gave us a timeout window of 50 weeks, 50. So that certainly does instill a sense of urgency, knowing that this is going to be the long game, even if we do move forward today. One just brief comment I have is we are happy to be held accountable to this committee in terms of, before any funds are transferred or used, we are more than happy to come back and provide finalized MOAs to make sure that it is, to everyone's liking, and, give monthly updates, everything like that. Even if you review the MOA now, you'll find that there is nothing in it related to the new aerators or components or anything, because we were not sure what it was going to come of this. So the MOA specifies what we typically had as annual commitments, $500 from Marathon County for electric, $700 from BEPCO for electric, WVIC contributing to the electric cost. So what's in there is what has always been done. It's nothing new at all. And so you're going to look at it and say, geez, all this stuff is missing. Yeah, it's all missing in terms of what would come of this. So we would be open to, whatever is recommended to put in that, and then bring it back to the committee for a final stamp of approval before we take any action as a partnership.
Go ahead if you want to.
I just want to say in relation to the MOA, dating back to 2010, the original Marathon County Task Force took place. I kind of predate, the faces have changed over the years, but the groups have all been involved in this for the past 12 years. So we've got a pretty good history on this. I believe the original MOA was 2010. We did one back then. And we've kind of just, we've just kind of tweaked it a little bit along the way, and not a lot has changed along the way. So, like I said, we've got a good long 12-year history of nobody's left the table. It's just the faces have changed.
Mm-hmm. Yes, John is the most senior member of the partnership. Everyone else is new.
Well, I guess we have a couple of options. You can advance it as is without the clarification, and we could, and I would. We can take it up at our February 21st meeting, and it could go to the county board that evening, but with our recommendation, or I guess those are, or we could take it into the March meeting when we've got some of those other issues resolved.
Mr. Chairman, with
Go ahead, Kurt.
If I could make a suggestion. Go ahead, Chair.
You're breaking up.
Sorry about that. I think the challenge I think that we're facing is even if we delay it now, I don't know that we'll, because we don't have any commitment as to new equipment. I don't know how the MOA actually gets clarified. I guess I think we got a chicken and egg situation, and I think that's what Christy, you're saying is, without understanding of whether the money is going to come from Marathon County to purchase the new equipment, we can't clarify that in the new MOA. Is that correct?
Yes.
So let me throw out a fourth option. And the fourth option would be for us to put in a provision authorizing the expenditure of funds subject to a MOU, not to be confused with an MOA, dealing with the capital side of it going forward. That would be beyond the 5 years. That would allow us to clarify the roles and responsibility. The MOA dealing with operational costs, and MOU binding the parties to the long term. You can deal with the issue of insurance and others. That's another option. Jamie.
Mr. Chair, thank you. That's exactly what I was going to bring up. And when we take on, we get a lot of donations to the county for, different things. And so I was going to suggest that I think the MOU, or whatever we have on the table, I think is separate from this purchase. That has to be in place whether we continue to operate our current system or whether we operate a new system. But I would suggest, and we have some templates that we could work off of and reverse them of when someone does a project for the county and then they donate it to us and we take it on as an asset. I think that would be a separate agreement and would be very, exactly what you just said, would be very appropriate for if we're going to be purchasing something and providing it as a donation. It's very clear on this is what we are contributing, this is how it will be transferred, this is the insurance requirements, and then reference the long-term maintenance of it, but it would be a separate agreement, and that's similar to what we do on the reverse side.
Supervisor Leahy.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Would this replace technically the language that ERC has already moved to the full board, recommended to the full board, or would this be an amendment situation, or would we be providing like a secondary option at the full board meeting?
So how I would envision it would be the topic would be on the county board's agenda and someone would have to move one of the two options to the floor. So they could either move the one without this amendment or the one with this amendment to the floor, and then that would be voted on.
And we've had that situation recently relative to the gas at the landfill, where we took a different stand than, I think, ERC. Again, I won't make any comments relative to us cleaning up after the ERC, but you can make those interpretations yourself. But we could work with the committee chair and explain what we're doing, and we can look at it in that case. That MOU would give us some flexibility in terms of the terms, and the release of the expenditure of the funds could be contingent upon that being in place. But then they could go ahead with the planning process. In that. So what are your wishes? Supervisor Leahy.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion.
Is that, you yield? Okay. Go ahead, Kurt. What is your motion?
My motion is to approve the use of the funds for, as spelled out, for the aeration system, contingent, and release of those funds contingent on an MOU being agreed upon as far as the long-term use and insurance and other issues that need to be spelled out, and long-term maintenance on the property.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Leahy. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Oh, go ahead, Gail.
Thank you, Chair. Does that also would you be willing to amend it to include that we would still pursue the grant from the DNR? Or is that just a given?
I would assume that that would be a given in that MOU, clarifying roles and responsibilities.
Because I did calculate that in the 2010 investment, Marathon County contributed 47%. And it appears, as proposed now, we're contributing 100%.
And the resolution does state up to 175,000. So let's just say best case scenario, we do get a DNR grant, perhaps that amount could lessen in time as well. So knocked on wood.
Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Sorry for subjecting you to this internal discussion, but I think it was needed in light of our ordinances and others. That's why. Take care. Good to see you. And you shouldn't. I used to work for the DNR and be in the remediation redevelopment program. It's not good to mention that we're leaking a quart of oil in front of a person that did environmental cleanups for
It's not going into the water.
it's a release to the environment.
It's in the building.
Okay, as long as it's contained. All right, thank you. We will move on then to a budget transfer for highway reserves. We have the reincarnated Jim Griesbach, also known as Kevin Lang, straight from Lake Wobegon.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. In your packet, we had a culvert on Highway KK that last fall, right around budget time, was identified as being an issue. It was kind of at the point of the budget where everything was pushed very far through. So we had submitted a request to get a transfer from our reserves to fund the replacement of that culvert during this construction season. We have a low bid for a concrete box culvert replacement at about $247,000 for that, and estimated additional 20-some thousand funds and materials for $275,000 in total material costs, and then we put $225,000 for our labor and equipment to replace that structure on Highway KK at that Black Creek crossing.
So the issue before us is the transfer of funds out of reserves to allow for the project to go forward. Does this also require should we amend the KIP as well as part of this? Because it's a capital expenditure above that, so.
I think that would make sense, Mr. Chair.
So it would be the budget transfer in required, can we do that under the language that we have before us today?
Yes.
All right, so are there any questions? So a motion to approve the transfer and to amend the 2023 capital improvement program to allow for the funding of the KK box culvert would be in order. And it did pass the infrastructure committee unanimously. Supervisor Hart.
I'll make a motion to approve that.
It's been moved by Supervisor Hart. Is our second? Second by Supervisor Leahy. Any discussion? Supervisor Hart.
Just a point of question, because we're amending KIP, we would need a 2/3 majority, correct?
We would need 2/3 majority for the transfer as well.
Correct.
Supervisor Marshall.
And what is the fund balance that they're taking 500,000 out of how much money?
Christie?
Yesterday, so
If you use a microphone.
I just got the transfer yesterday. I haven't been able to take a look. I'll get that to you and I'll email it to you.
Kevin, do you know what our balance is approximately?
I I do not. That's part of the budgeting usually Commissioner and Finance Department take care of. So I don't have hands-on knowledge of that one or daily knowledge of it.
We will have that information by the county board and provide that to you if that is of solace to you. It would be good to have that today.
It just seems early in the year to be spending if it's like 80% of what we have carried over. So it's important to know how much of it we're spending.
I think we have significantly more than 500,000 and
Closing the road.
I know we've drawn down some. This is not the county's fund balance, but rather the highway reserves. So we're not taking out of the county's fund balance that could impact our borrowing going forward. It is out of the highway reserves where we get money from the state and we carry it over into the future. So it's not like some of the other transfers. Go ahead.
I do have the amounts that we had put together for a spreadsheet on the 2023 budget. So I have those, and the unrestricted fund balance at the highway department at this time is $23,600,000, and that's prior to us closing out that. And then we did take a portion of that was used for the 2023 CIP already. So I'll get you updated information. I didn't know about the transfer till yesterday, but that's what we started with. And I think that we were using about 9.3 to 9.5 in the 2023 CIP for highway projects at this time, so that I can get that to you. But that's our starting point.
Does that help?
If I may, Mr. Chair. My recollection, looking at the budget, we used 9.4, the board approved $9.359 million out of highway reserve as part of the 2023 budget. And just to elaborate on Chair Robinson's point relative to reserve, it also is different fund, of course, than the contingency fund, which as part of your budget, you set aside $800,000 for. As I inferred from your question, as expenses come up during the year, we are early in the year, it's nice to have that contingency fund. That again is separate, but I hope we can have that additional cleanup number to you before the meeting.
Yeah, so rough estimates at the 23.6 minus the 9.35 minus this additional 500,000 would still be a amount of a little over about 13.8, and that's prior to finalizing the 2022 fund balance.
That does help. Thank you.
All right, any other questions? If not, all those in favor of the motion to transfer and amend the KIP will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right. Energy Task Force Charter. I'll turn it over to Supervisor Lemmer and Deputy Administrator Holman.
Great, thanks, Mr. Chair. So just a quick background. When we were talking about the strategic plan, I was really hoping we could get something in the strategic plan to elevate this issue, but it really looks like it is too big, too wide to put it in a strategic plan without really studying. So when I was doing some research, there are other counties in the state that have looked at things like their electrical use and their fuel purchasing and even building permit regulations in their county-owned facilities. So it just seemed to make sense that we take a look at what we're currently doing in the field of energy use, and then what are some opportunities to get something realistic in a strategic plan. And then if there is, let's budget for it and get that in the budget fairly soon. So really what I have on the slides that are there is kind of the outline of what the charter may look like based on the feedback from the last meeting. So in general, our mission and purpose would really be for us to study and then establish countywide energy policies with the ultimate goal of maximizing our efficiencies and, capitalizing on the new laws and the fundings that are available so that we can have a more affordable, reliable, resilient, and ultimately fiscally sustainable practice. So if we look at the justifications as to why, that would be really because our energy costs have gone up. I look at my own home. In the last period, we've gone up about 20% for our energy, and that's, water and our electrical and some of the other utilities that we have. So at our house, we're looking at ways that we can economize. I would imagine that's the same at the county level. If we look at recent outages nationwide and then specifically in December in Wisconsin, it really demonstrates that we should be building this resiliency so that we have our continuity of operations. And then going on, we have these financial opportunities available to us, so we can, I think, help out our taxpayers and our county by tapping into those. It is in our Marathon County Comp Plan, so it fits what we should be able to do. If you look at, it's a utility goal under the, in Chapter 8, the infrastructure. Number 3 says that we should promote energy conservation and increase use of renewable energy. And then sub A is adopt innovative policies and practices for energy efficiency and sustainable building design. So I think it fits. As far as membership goes, I would be open. It clearly is a financial thing. So, I'm raising my hand if we're looking for volunteers. But I think it fits under a number of different things, and it just depends on what the task force decides is our path. It has environmental implications. It clearly has infrastructure implications. It might even have some of the other groups that you see on the screen there. So I would encourage, Chair Gibbs or whomever is wanting to put their hands in the air to come from those groups. But clearly we'll have other opportunities for the business community or utilities to chime in. And then what are official duties and responsibilities? Well, again, it's hard to say because we have to do that research. So I think it's working with Chair Robinson. You said the facilities and capital management might be a good place to start. But we would establish those goals. So we have to get that baseline. We have to then analyze and evaluate that data to decide really what are areas of opportunity, and then really look at does it pencil? Does it have an ROI, and does it have a payback period that is reasonable? Once we get that information, then we'll know if we need to reach out who those partners would be. So the timeline is pretty sketchy. It looks a little ambitious. But if we are going to notice something opportunistic that has a KIP project, it really needs to be decided in the fall and then worked through going forward. So possible outcomes and deliverables, again, are up in the air, but obviously we would get a report back that would have the analysis and the evaluation, and then whatever suggestions that might be coming from that, depending on that ROI. And so really, I think what I'm asking for is for this to go to the exec committee and for this to go to the full board to establish that task force so we can get started on the investigation.
Chris?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And, Supervisor Lemmer summarized everything pretty well, I think. One thing I'd like to stress, too, is that, some of this may seem intuitive, on the surface, like, oh, well, maybe we should just do this. I know the county, we have invested some money in, shifting lights to LEDs and things like that. We do have a very small amount of funding that we use for sort of efficiency projects when we find them, or for things like lights, but it's not a lot. And so the thing to stress here is that there's no sort of there's no predestined outcome that anybody's looking for. And so from my point of view, I'm relatively agnostic in terms of what might be the opportunity that you would find. But in terms of the bigger picture, if this were to provide any sort of stabilization for utility costs, that would then fold into the budget as a whole. The questions that would come up along the way would be, if you did realize savings through a particular project, would you put that into the general fund? Would you reinvest it into something that would kind of build on another opportunity should one arise? Things like that. And I think that we know that there are unique opportunities that the county could take advantage of through the Inflation Reduction Act and other sources of funding that, and there are various points of view on that. But essentially, from my point of view, Marathon County residents are all federal taxpayers, or most of them anyhow. And so it would make sense that if there were opportunities to harness some of those funds and bring them back to the county for something that allows us to, chip away at stabilizing the mill rate, if that's a consideration, or provide some degree of fiscal relief given the constraints that we have to live under, that would be a laudable goal. There is a chance that maybe you go through the task force process and you come out the other side and there's not really something that's feasible, something that really has the return on investment that people are looking for. So I think you just want to make sure that people realize that it's the whole point from my perspective is that this conversation, that the question is, do you want to have the conversation? Do you want to convene the different stakeholders and figure out if something's there and sort of expand upon what's in the strategic plan, to then come back and say, here's what we found, and then make decisions at that point based on some of the outcomes that Supervisor Leonard mentioned earlier. And I think the timeline may be a little aggressive, but I think that that's also useful in terms of prodding the conversation, and part of bringing it to you and exec and the county board and keeping some of the initial thoughts on this narrow is to provide a focus so that if it were to happen, that when you do convene people, there's a real target out of the gate, and you're not kind of spinning your wheels wondering in those first few meetings, like, well, what should we do? Or what do we want to talk about? Which in my experience can happen in some of those conversations. Lots of good intentions and time is spent, but you don't get some sort of actionable steps. And so if we have guidance within the charter and it gets established, then I think it's not unreasonable to say that by the end of this year, by November, you would have some ideas that could be forwarded. Maybe it wouldn't be the right time, but you would probably have identified a couple of things to consider at that point. And that begs the question, looking further ahead to say, okay, if there were opportunities that were identified, funded, and they were successful, then we could discuss again, should the task force continue to explore other things that, haven't been really dug into in that initial kind of jump or foray into the conversation. So overall, I think in terms of timing and the funding opportunity, it's unique. It's a good time to see if there were opportunities and also to harness some of that federal funding and state funding, across the board, figure out how can you diversify your funding portfolio, so to speak, to bring back some benefits to the county and ultimately county residents.
I'd just like to highlight that in this year's budget, we had earmarked $404,000 toward increased fuel costs, which is one of the reasons why we might want to, for natural gas cost, it pays to do it. But, I'd like to just comment on the shortness of the task force. I think task forces linger sometimes, and if you've got a shorter period of time, you tend to get more concentrated interest and attention and sometimes better results because there's a focus on trying to develop a project. So I think this is good. Supervisor Lemmer and I talked last week, and I thought it was important that if we do this, that we have it available for the 2024 budget process. And the tight time frame reflects that if we're going to be meaningful. And quite honestly, the bipartisan infrastructure law, the Inflation Reduction Act, and other things have time sensitive. But I know within the Metropolitan Planning Organization for the immediate Wausau area that there were funds that were allocated. Rib Mountain in Weston looked at electric vehicles in their fleet for their Department of Public Works. The city of Wausau looked at changing the lighting to get more energy efficient lighting, reducing their ongoing operational costs. So there are many opportunities out there for funding if we take advantage of it. This task force could focus in on those types of activities. So are there any questions for Supervisor Lemmer, or you know, what you have in the packet in terms of the narrative is different than, there are some nuances relative to the membership, which is reflecting some of the comments that were made by Administrator Leonard and others at the last meeting, trying to expand the membership to be more inclusive of parks and solid waste and others. But what are your wishes? Supervisor Leahy.
I would make a motion to approve the charter, and it has to go on to the exec now. Recommend it to the executive committee.
Is there a second? Any discussion? Supervisor Hart seconded, and discussion. If not, all those in favor of recommending adoption of the, or adopting it, recommending adoption to the executive committee will signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Opposed, no. Then motion carries unanimously. Thank you. All right, budget process 2023. Cody, are you want to?
Yeah, I can take on a little bit of this. So I sat down with Lance and the chair to talk about kind of adopting the budget process in terms of St. Croix County and the specific nuances of our very large county board. One of the key differences is that St. Croix County is a 19-member board. We are a 38-member board. So we talked about how to kind of make sure that the various committees of jurisdiction would all have input into budget priorities for specific sections, and then, you know, make sure that we can also include the full board, and then, you know, move that forward in a way that would, like I said, make sense for all of us. I guess I'll give it to Lance to go into the details. What we kind of did was I kind of went through and thought out of a very rigorous committee system, and Lance kind of worked that in with the St. Croix plan, which is more focused on the full county board. One of the things that we talked about is that the full county board, it's just too large, and we have this committee system in place where we can talk about the specific programs within those jurisdictions, and that would work much better as opposed to us having potentially very, very, very long full meetings with a 38-member board. So Lance, I'll switch that over to you.
Sure, thank you. So just again to flesh out some context, the meeting was held yesterday, so if you were hoping for me to have a really developed plan, I'm sorry to disappoint. But as Supervisor Hart referenced and Chair Robinson referenced, we met and just kind of had general conversations trying to really incorporate the feedback and discussion that this committee had, as well as the feedback and discussion that was received at the full board relative to the budget process for 2023, and try to put together a rough outline of the steps that we would follow as not only as administration and staff, but certainly as your various committees and your full board. And in my mind, just to start from a really high level, and Supervisor Hart kind of already did this, we sought to capture some of the big takeaways that we heard, and one of those was really engaging the county board, the full board, much earlier in the process. And I want to have a discussion about what that's going to look like in a little bit. That's where we'll probably spend most of our time today, but I recognize you've been meeting for a while already, so we'll try to move it along. But engaging the full board earlier, the second big idea was clarifying, as Supervisor Hart referenced, clarifying the standing committee role and process relative to considering what I'll term program modifications. Really, that idea that at the end of the day, the county board, you and your various committees are the experts relative to the community need and desire relative to what services we deliver and at what service level we deliver them. And then the last big takeaway is this idea of bringing, again, the full board along relative to the presentation of the administrative proposed budget, as opposed to having the real detailed presentation that I gave to this committee as part of your budget process, and then a very abbreviated presentation to the full board, trying to bring those things together. Because one of the pieces of feedback that we discussed was the verbalization that other members of other committees didn't feel as though they had the benefit of that same detailed presentation. And the way we sought to do that, and I'll get into a little bit more detail later, but bringing the county board and this committee together really at the latter stages of the process with that full presentation, trying to allow enough time, as Chair Robinson verbalized a number of times in the budget discussions, making sure that there was enough time, that supervisors had enough time to chew on the budget, both before HR Finance and Property moved it to the full board, and also after the public hearing, to make sure that there was some time for amendments. So let me talk a little bit about how we tried to accomplish those things underneath the operating budget process, starting in April with, I apologize for the abbreviation, but Committee of the Whole, or a full board meeting. And of course, all these, I need to work with Christy to make sure the dates and times, or the dates will work here. They're really just placeholders, but I think you'll get the idea of our discussion we had yesterday. That full board meeting, we really termed it as a budget retreat, led by the HR Finance and Property Committee Chair, the board chair, and county administration staff, which would include, of course, myself, Deputy Administrator Holman, and Christy. But this idea of a budget 101, and there's a lot to the county budget. I think we've heard that a number of times from not only at this committee, but I mean, I can tell you from staff, I certainly learn things every day about the complexities of our budget. And your meeting earlier today demonstrated that with how budget amendments are going to work. But the Budget 101 would cover a number of things, mandatory and discretionary program overviews. So there's a lot of discussion about what do counties have to do. That was one of the pieces of feedback that I got from a number of supervisors, that they felt it would be beneficial to kind of have that as a background, a bit of context for what programs and services we deliver. So we would do that again in an abbreviated fashion, but we would talk about mandatory and discretionary programs in each of the departments. We talk about funding sources, and this gets at this idea that we try to summarize when we say not every dollar in the county board budget is this, or the county budget is the same, right? You know, you have dollars that come from tax levy, and certainly that is a different dollar as opposed to a dollar that you have in terms of revenue perhaps at the highway department for doing maintenance work, plowing work on state highways. So we talk about those various funding sources with specific references to contracts and user fees. We talk about an overview of budget priorities, and I'll bring up a document. This is really something that came right out of St. Croix County that I think the three of us thought when we met that is something we haven't done in this county. We've talked a lot about budget assumptions, which I'll talk about later, but we haven't really talked about budget priorities, and I'll show you that document in a minute. But the idea is we'll go over what those budget priorities might look like and begin to have a conversation. The board would have the conversation. Staff are there to listen and provide information. But ultimately, again, this is where the county board needs to provide guidance to staff in building the budget. But then also we talk about the current budget assumptions. And as you all know, budget assumptions made in April are not nearly as good as budget assumptions as we get later in the year. But nevertheless, the idea was to incorporate those into that budget 101. So then you'll see as we move forward, that's when, after that budget 101 and that mandatory discretionary overview by department, the idea, to Supervisor Hart's earlier point, is The next step is really for those standing committees of jurisdiction to dive in and really take a look at what are the service levels, what are the programs within their under their spheres of influence, and provide that direction of whether or not they envision a recommendation for those to change. Historically, it has been my experience that that hasn't really been an area where much has changed. Many of our budgets are status quo budgets, for lack of a better term. We are looking for the most efficient and effective ways to deliver the services that the county board has previously indicated that they desire staff to deliver, but we really haven't had fundamental shifts in terms of, you know, what we're getting out of. Jamie brought up the ice rink. We've looked for the best ways to deliver the services, maximize revenue, maximize efficiency, but we haven't received direction, as far as I can tell in the past, that like, you know what, we're not going to do this anymore. And that makes logical sense to me, but of course that's the prerogative of the board. The logical sense that it makes to me is we deliver a lot of things that people really like. There's not too many things that we deliver that people don't like that we're not required to do. There are things that they don't like, but we're required to do those things. But that's kind of the middle part of that, the middle part of the budget process is really that internal standing committee discussion. And I want to bounce back just a little bit to the budget priorities to talk about what that looks like. And this is a decision matrix. So it was altered slightly from St. Croix County, but really those big picture ideas that the county board would be providing guidance to myself and other staff as we build the budget, all the department heads, about what you're looking for in terms of priorities within the budget. So I'll go through these very quickly, and I'll send this all out to all of you. Still making some modifications to it, but I'll certainly send it out. We'll make sure that it also gets in your next meeting packet, because my hope is that we can have a brief discussion. You can, of course, chew on it some more, and we can have a discussion at your next meeting. But the first one you see on the far left, the icon of growing capital reserves, right? Whether you call it growing or maintaining capital reserves. The idea being, does the county board, through the other priorities you've identified in the budget process, have you indicated that, hey, you need to use capital reserves for purposes of operations? We haven't historically done much of that. We've done it on occasion. I would hesitate to say whether or not we're unique or not. I know there are a great many counties that do that on an annual basis, utilize reserves for various approaches. We have not, as we talked about ad nauseum during our budget process this last year. But should you do that, should we do that, you would identify the priority. Don't use them. Number one, we do not want you to dip into reserves. I need that direction. And you could tell me that by saying, hey, this is a top priority, as opposed to, if you said, you know what, this is a number two, use it as necessary. Historically, this last year, for example, Chair Robinson already brought this up, we didn't have to utilize reserves for our increased energy costs because we had the American Rescue Plan Act funds to utilize to do that. Absent those available to us, that budget process would have been different. We would have either been looking to, one, cut $400,000 from some other area, or we'd be looking for an alternative funding strategy to do that, and reserves could serve that strategy. So you'll see that idea from those budget priorities there. The second one is even more straightforward, I think, employee compensation. And I modified this to kind of really be tailored appropriately for Marathon County. The vast majority of counties in the state of Wisconsin, vast majority of local governments, operate on a step scale system. We do not. We have a pay for performance system, but we do have that compensation plan that was approved earlier, or I should say last year. So if employee compensation in the eyes of the board is a top priority, that is, you see it as something that needs to be addressed because, for example, you believe we're falling behind our market target, you might term that a top number one priority, and what the column on the right side of the page is how I would respond in building the budget. So you see, if it's a top priority, that you feel it's a top priority, I'm going to look for not only the pay for performance allocation, but we may make a cost of living adjustment to the scale. So again, you recall back to the conversation we had relative to the compensation plan update. I had said that historically had not been something we'd done. We hadn't done cost of living adjustments for that scale for a great many years. So if you make it a top priority, we would do both the performance allocation and we would come back with a recommendation for that cost of living adjustment to the scale. And conversely, as you move down the priority system, you'll see that the response kind of correlates or is commensurate to that. If it's a number two priority, it would be a significant pay for performance allocation. And an example for that might be that you see we'd be in an environment where there is significant inflation, perhaps, that we don't need to move the scale. We don't need to shift the cost of living adjustment for the scale, but we need a 3%, and I just picked this number out. We haven't had 3%, more than 3% for pay for performance as far back as I can remember, quite honestly. We did this recent modification of the comp plan, but before that, our pay for performance allocations had ranged between they've been around 2%, 2.3, and 3%. So you'll see number two and number three are kind of those variations. And then the last one, if the fiscal constraints that you as the board see, our fiscal environment is such that no increases is your priority, or it's a number four priority, that would be no increase. And I won't go through these in as excruciating detail as I just did the first two, but you'll see another area where I think there's ripe for discussion is health insurance, position expansion or contraction as well. I tried to add a little bit more nuance to the range for position expansion or contraction than what St. Croix County had. We have historically not funded a great many new positions, and last year's budget was very similar to that. In previous budgets that I've put forward, we hadn't had new positions. And then the last piece is operating expenses. I'd love to say that if you identified number one as a priority, that we would be able to do that, fund all of the operating expense requests that would come in. But I think we probably live in priority number two there, where we're prioritizing necessities, needs, and wants. Of course, if you did prioritize, no, you said, no, this is a top priority to fund the budgets that were submitted by departments, that's probably going to lead to, at the top of this, some alternative funding strategies like utilizing capital reserves. So again, this is the matrix that I modified it based on the discussion I had with Chair Robinson and Supervisor Hart, but it is largely drawn from St. Croix County. So you'll see that's the discussion we would have at that committee of the whole meeting, an overview of the budget priorities. The way that the budget priorities as well as the budget assumptions would ultimately be incorporated through the budget. The process is that the initial recommendation would come from this body for each of those two things. The budget assumptions based just on timing, those come later in the year. But again, HR, Finance, and Property would be the ones charged with the responsibility to bring forward a recommendation, but that would still go through the whole county board. In terms of budget assumptions, again, just to make sure that everyone's recalling what those discussions had been, we bring before you budget assumptions relative to revenue and relative to expense. I'll start with the latter, relative to expense. Salaries and wages are one of the primary budget assumptions you look at. Health insurance, our Wisconsin retirement system allocation, dental and workers' comp. Revenue assumptions, Christy brings to you, and again, the reason these are later in the year is because we need more time to get more data to really understand where they're likely to come in. But property tax collection, most importantly, net new construction, sales tax, and transportation aids, those are the things that are that would fall under that budget assumptions piece, that both the budget assumptions ultimately get built into the budget, but also the budget priorities can certainly help me and Christy and Deputy Administrator Holman when we have those interactions with department heads, when I frame my budget letter to department heads to give them guidance on what type of budgets I expect from each of them. Your budget priorities would be greatly beneficial in having those conversations. So that's kind of the process that we tried to put together. And I will send this out because it's still in the process. But the last thing I wanted to talk about was when we get to the that last priority, the last piece of feedback that we kind of identified in our conversations, this idea of getting the budget to the HR Financing Committee and to the full board earlier, such that they had more time to consider the budget and make amendment recommendations both prior to HR Finance adopting the budget and after. You'll see I tried to capture that here with the county administrator presentation of the budget to both the HR Finance and Property Committee and the full board together, as opposed to just primarily to you. And then our process the last several years has been to send a link to that video presentation. The feedback again that we got was, hey, we would like to be part of that presentation, so we modified that. Allowing amendments then to be proposed. The next line, the amendments proposed to the budget due from supervisors for consideration by your committee, by this committee, prior to you actually forwarding the budget on to the full county board. You did make some modifications to the budget, you'll recall, in 2023 before you sent it on to the board. But this trying to lay out specifically within the process that your fellow supervisors, your colleagues are encouraged to submit those recommendations prior to your ultimate review and recommendation of that budget for publication and move it to the full board. Similarly, you'll see after the public hearing on the budget, the idea again to allow county board members, not only from this committee, but from all of your colleagues to have the opportunity to consider that public input for purposes of generating amendment recommendations. Again, allowing for those amendment recommendations to be considered by this body. I know that was a bit of a challenge based on the total number of amendments you had, that were recommended this year. But my thought is that, and our thought in our meeting was that if we allowed more of those amendments to come earlier, perhaps you wouldn't have so many coming in at the end. So that's my attempt to summarize our conversation yesterday and start to lay out what that process is going to look like. I'll certainly have to sit down with Christy and make sure we'll work backwards from the date of budget adoption and the publication deadlines, but I hope that was kind of in keeping with our conversation yesterday.
So the intent was to introduce it, get some very high-level feedback, understanding that we need to probably refine it, but then it would be a subject of discussion at our next meeting or two, and then take it to the county board for presentation at the March meeting, so that if there's agreement that this is a process that they're comfortable with, we would begin the process in April, if that makes sense. So I don't, are there any high-level comments? And again, we'll get into the details and the specifics. Now, let me just be for full disclosure. The problems with this process are that we are dependent upon the state for funding for many programs, and the state budget won't be adopted until late June, July, or sometimes later. So there are a lot of external factors, the whole discussion on shared revenue. Will it be GPR and general purpose revenue and sales tax? And what opportunities are there within that? Those could come after we begin our process, so we may have to adjust based upon some of those external factors. But it is, as we approach it, it is based upon the best information available at that time, subject to adjustments based on reality. We could be, and the first time is going to be interesting. Next year, it would be easier because the legislature has a 2-year budget, which will make it easier for us. But every 2 years, we'll have that lag between when the legislature is and what our legislature does and what our timelines are. So we need to make sure you understand that going in. It'll make it an interesting first year. Any other comments, Supervisor Leahy?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just wondering if there will be an emphasis put on, the idea that if you have questions or concerns or priorities that are outside of your assigned committees, will we be encouraging our colleagues to attend the appropriate committee meetings so that they can get into a more high-level discussion about those things and, again, front-load that and not have it at the end?
Supervisor Hart.
Actually, one thing that I would add to that, that's Committee of the Whole Budget Retreat, if we're calling it that, would be an overview of committee jurisdiction specifically. Because, and I want to emphasize this too, this is almost the same, it's not quite, but it's very similar to the process that ran out this year, except there were many supervisors that did not participate in the committee discussion of these programs. And then after the fact was kind of like, well, I wish I had input. My prime example would be Family Keys, where we had supervisors who said, I never knew that Family Keys was added back to the budget. And I was like, well, I heard 3 separate presentations that it was. So these are happening. We just need colleagues that are going to actually, and we're giving a very clear way of these are the committees. If you're not able to attend those committees, please contact the chairs or the vice chairs of the committees to give your input. And then we're also coming back after these committees discuss too to finalize those priorities. And I have kind of another document too that very clearly spells out what departments are in jurisdiction for each committee. And I think that should also be included too. So there's very clear parameters as to where, if you have a very specific discussion over something, to go to those committees, or as I said, contact the chairs of those committees. We are just too big of a board to have those microscopic discussions about very specific programs as a board. I think that's what we kind of found out in this last budget process, is that those are discussions that need to be made specifically in committees because we just don't have the time to do that. And if we do, it becomes very, very long committees, or a very long county board meeting. So yeah, that's kind of what I'm hoping to incorporate in there. Thank you.
All right, any other comments? Or we will be revisiting this probably at the next 2 meetings, but we wanted to share that with you. I think we're trying to be more participatory, more inclusive, and spell out the process. Last time was a learning experience both of county board procedures and the county budgeting process and the county budget for many, half the board. So this will be new and hopefully address some of the concerns we had raised by members relative to their understanding of it. But I think one of the keys is the presentation of the budget to the entire board at the same time that we're getting it, so we're all getting the information together. Supervisor Hart.
And then another thing was, obviously we had a lot of new elected supervisors. That's why in this discussion I wanted to be a part of that, because I was a new elected supervisor. In this process, we start that discussion with a high-level overview of the budget in April. So, if we come to whenever the next board is seated, if we have new supervisors, they will be included right away in that April discussion to have very painfully noticed where those discussions can be had, how this budget process plays out. Everyone will start off on the same page together. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Just building on kind of the comments to make some modifications to the Committee of the Whole or Budget 101 meeting. If anyone has any thoughts that, as you're ruminating on this at a later point, it's like, oh, this would be another thing that would be really helpful, please just reach out and let me know. I think the feedback, the sense I'm getting, not only today, but I got it in my meeting with both Chair Robinson and Supervisor Hart and from several other board members, that April meeting, that budget retreat is very important. So it will certainly be long, but if there's something that really needs to happen there, please let me know and I'll make sure to get it in here, and we'll, April is not all that far away, so we'll need to start working on putting this together.
All right, we will carry that over and have some discussions going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Any ideas for future meetings? We seem to never be having a shortage of agenda items. For the next meeting, we will be dealing with claims and costs and probably spend a little bit more time on some of those reports, get an overview from Christie and the capability. We will be looking at the grant in the Sheriff's Department for the county's equitable sharing agreement and certification. We will be dealing with the budget process and other items from an educational perspective, including our work plan. Anything else? At some point in time, and Kurt, if you're still on, we probably need to do an opioid update.
Yeah, well, Mr. Chair, if I might, it's scheduled for the exec committee to take up, at least at a high level, which committees they want to, be involved in potential planning and use of those funds. So absolutely, that will be provided at the executive committee, but then be brought back potentially to each of the committees. And whether or not there's actually, as some counties have created, they've created a task force to understand, one, the amount of dollars available, and then two, the potential for uses and options for potential joint ventures with other municipalities, other counties. So the first discussions will be next month at the this month at the exec committee meeting next week on 16th.
All right, anything else? If not, our next meeting is the 21st. And what are your wishes relative to item number 9? Supervisor Leahy moves.
I would like to make
adjourn. Supervisor Chair Gibbs seconds.
And I would like to know how my new
Supervisor
Wi-Fi is working.
Zhang seconds. I'm sorry. I stand corrected. So Leahy, Zhang, all those in favor of adjournment signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. We are adjourned.